They say when your heart finally breaks for the last time, it doesn't shatter. It just stops making noise. That's how it felt for me. Not an explosion, not even tears. Just stillness. Like someone had turned the volume of my life all the way down. After the fourth breakup in 5 years, I didn't want advice or sympathy anymore. I didn't want anyone telling me that time heals or that I'd find the right person eventually. I'd heard it all before. This time, I just wanted quiet. So I packed a rucksack with the essentials, a tent, some instant coffee, a notebook, a torch, and left London before dawn. The motorway stretched endlessly north until the city melted into motorways, and the motorways into wet, winding roads that led deeper into the highlands. By the time I reached the edge of Invermere Forest, the sun was already low, and the mist clung to the trees like it had no intention of letting go. I parked the car on a dirt verge, locked it, and started walking. Each step away from the road felt like unlearning noise, the hum of traffic, the buzz of messages, the endless chatter that had filled every inch of my head. My boots sank into damp moss as I hiked along the trail, the air cool and heavy with pine and rain. The higher I climbed, the thinner the world felt. Fewer sounds, fewer thoughts, fewer ghosts. I didn't have a destination in mind, only distance. Eventually, I found it. A quiet ridge above a narrow valley, 2 tall pines guarding a small clearing. The ground was uneven, but it overlooked the whole world below, locks glinting faintly through fog, hills rolling like ocean waves frozen in motion. It was perfect. It was nowhere. I pitched my tent slowly, half because I was tired, half because I didn't know what to do with myself once I stopped moving. The rhythm of pulling ropes and hammering pegs was grounding, methodical. When I finally lit the small campfire, its orange glow looked too alive against the grays and greens of the evening. The silence settled in properly after that. No phones, no music, no people, just wind threading through the branches and the occasional distant cry of a bird. It was unsettling at first. I'd told myself I wanted peace, but peace isn't soft at the start. It's loud in its own way. It makes you listen to everything you've been avoiding. Sitting by the fire, I found myself thinking about the people who'd left dents in me. The first was Jamie, charming, clever, and utterly allergic to commitment. He used to joke that he loved me best when I wasn't around. Then there was Alex, who drank more than he laughed. I tried to love him sober and broken, but eventually realized he didn't want either version of himself saved. Tom came after that. Loud, ambitious, obsessed with plans and futures that never included me. And the last one, Theo. The one who smiled through every lie, who held my hand at my father's funeral and let go before the first anniversary. Each name felt like a bruise when I said it in my head. I stared into the fire until the tears came, not loud, messy ones, just quiet ones that blurred the flames. Maybe this was what healing really looked like. Not closure, not forgiveness, just sitting with the ache until it stopped trying to swallow you whole. When the fire sank to embers, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, the fabric muffled, the world even more, turning the night into something almost sacred. I lay flat on my back, staring at the faint outline of tree shadows above me. My body ached pleasantly from the hike, and my thoughts were slow, almost bearable. I thought about how long it had been since I'd been alone by choice. Years, maybe. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness feels like waiting for someone to arrive. Solitude feels like remembering you're enough when no one does. Outside, the wind shifted. It carried the faint scent of peat smoke from somewhere far off, though I saw no light, no sign of another soul. Still, a strange comfort came with the smell. Proof that someone, somewhere out there, was awake too. For a moment I wondered who they were. Maybe a farmer. Maybe another wanderer like me. Someone else trying to disappear. The thought made me smile for the first time that day. As I drifted toward sleep, the silence grew deeper, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. But just before my thoughts completely quieted, I heard something faint. A sound that didn't belong to wind or forest. Hoofbeats. Slow, steady, rhythmic. I held my breath, listening. They were distant, almost ghostly, fading in and out between gusts of wind. I told myself it was just my imagination. Probably a deer, maybe a trick of the fire's crackle. But even as the sound faded, my heart kept pace with it, that strange, deliberate rhythm, as if something out there had already noticed me. When I finally fell asleep, the last thing I saw through the half-open flap of my tent was the sky, a smear of silver clouds and one bright, stubborn star refusing to be hidden by the mist. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't wishing for love, just for peace. And maybe, if the Highlands were kind enough, a reason to believe in something gentle again. I woke before dawn to the sound of rain tapping gently against the tent. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. My mind reached for the usual city noises, traffic, alarms, someone arguing through a thin wall. But there was only rain and wind, the kind of soft, ancient sound that seemed to have existed long before people learned to break silence. I boiled a small pot of water on my camping stove and made instant coffee, watching the steam curl and vanish into the air. The world outside was pale and washed clean. The ridge, the pines, the loch below, all shrouded in a faint mist. It was so beautiful it almost felt rude to move. By mid-morning, the rain stopped, and the sun made a half-hearted attempt to appear. I decided to explore further up the ridge. My legs protested, clearly not used to real hills. But the stillness around me made every ache worth it. The trail was empty. No hikers, no noise, just the whisper of wind through heather and the occasional rustle of a hare darting out of sight. I kept walking until I reached a ledge overlooking a deep valley, where the land fell away in layers of green and gray. I sat there for a long time, letting the silence do what it does best, fill the spaces where words used to be. That was when I heard it again. Faint, distant, but unmistakable this time. Hoofbeats. I froze. It came from somewhere down the slope, steady and unhurried, the sound of iron meeting stone. I half expected it to fade like before, another trick of the wind, but it grew clearer. Through the fog, a figure began to form, dark at first, then slowly taking shape. A man on horseback, moving along the path below, his silhouette strong and deliberate against the soft blur of the hills. He wasn't rushing. He rode the way some people walk when they've nowhere urgent to be. Shoulders relaxed, reins held loose, head tilted slightly down as if lost in thought. When he saw me, he slowed. The horse stopped a few meters away, its breath steaming in the cool air. For a moment we just looked at each other. Two strangers wrapped in mist, both slightly out of place. "Morning," he said at last. His voice was low, warm, touched with a Highland lilt that curled around every word. "Morning," I replied, a little too quickly. "Didn't think I'd see anyone out here." "Didn't plan to be seen," he said with a faint smile. He tipped the brim of his hat. Yes, an actual hat, wide-brimmed and dusted with rain. "Got turned around somewhere past the loch. Thought I'd cut through the ridge before dark." I stood, brushing soil from my hands. "You're a bit far off any proper track." He nodded. "So are you." Fair point. The horse shifted its weight, stamping lightly on the wet ground. Up close she was beautiful. Chestnut coat, gentle eyes, her saddle worn but cared for. "Mind if I stop a while?" he asked. "She's tired. Don't want to push her too hard before we find the path again." I hesitated. Not because he seemed dangerous. He didn't. There was something steady about him, the kind of calm that made you want to breathe slower just standing near it. I'd just grown unused to company, that was all. "Sure," I said, nodding towards the fire pit I'd used the night before. "You can rest there." He dismounted in one smooth motion, boots landing with a soft thud. When he pushed his hat back, I saw him properly. Early 40s, maybe. Sun-worn skin, short dark blonde hair touched with silver at the temples, and a few lines around his eyes that suggested he'd smiled often once, though maybe not recently. "Appreciate it," he said. "Name's Callum." "Evan," I replied. He tied his horse to a low branch, then crouched near the cold fire pit, rubbing his hands together. His fingers were rough, nails faintly stained with soil and wood resin. "You out here for the peace or the punishment?" he asked after a minute. I laughed softly. "Bit of both, I think." He nodded like he understood. Peace can be punishing at first. That line lingered in the air between us. I poured the last of my coffee into a tin cup and offered it to him. He accepted it with a quiet thanks, sipping slowly. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was just complete. "The kind you don't want to break. Do you live nearby?" I asked eventually. "Few miles west," he said. "Got a small place. Couple of horses, bit of land. Nothing grand. Sounds peaceful," he gave a half smile. "Sometimes too peaceful." Something in his tone caught me. Not sadness, exactly. Just the weight of someone who's spent too long with his own thoughts. I studied him while pretending not to. There was a stillness about him that reminded me of the land. Solid, unmoving, patient. The kind of man who doesn't chase moments, but lets them come to him. When he looked up and caught me staring, I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "Sorry," I said quickly. You look familiar somehow." "Doubt that," he said with a small grin. "I don't stray far from the hills." He set down the cup and stood, stretching his back with a soft groan. The movement drew my attention to the way his shoulders filled out his coat, the quiet strength of someone used to labor. "Not Jim's. Well," he said, glancing at the sky. "Looks like rain again soon." "Highland forecast never lies," I said. He chuckled. "No, just changes its mind every 10 minutes. We both smiled then. A small, shared thing. But it felt like the first real human connection I'd had in months. He adjusted the horse's reins, then looked at me again. "I'll camp a bit further down the ridge tonight. Don't worry, I won't crowd you." For reasons I couldn't explain, the thought of him leaving left a small ache behind my ribs. "You don't have to go far," I said before I could stop myself. "There's plenty of space here, and a decent view if you like watching clouds argue." He smiled again, softer this time. I do." He led the horse a few steps closer and began unpacking his saddle. The sight of him there, calm, capable, framed by the mist, felt oddly grounding, like the world had been tilting for years and had just now found its balance again. As he set up camp near mine, I caught myself thinking that maybe peace wasn't about being alone after all. Maybe it was about finding someone whose silence sounded like your own. By dusk, the weather had changed its mind again. The mist had thickened into low, restless clouds, and a thin drizzle hung in the air like breath that wouldn't fade. Callum and I spent the afternoon in easy, almost wordless company, collecting fallen branches, fixing a ring of stones round the fire pit, sharing the kind of silence that feels less like distance and more like trust beginning to grow roots. When the rain started properly, it was sudden, a silver sheet sweeping across the ridge. We both scrambled for cover. I ducked into my tent, zipped it shut, and listened to the rain hammer the canvas. A moment later came his voice through the downpour, muffled but close. "Mind if I get my gear under the awning? Don't fancy waking to soggy socks." "Go for it," I called back. The flap rustled and a rush of damp air followed him inside the little overhang. Then, after another minute of thunder and indecision, he laughed quietly. "Suppose it's daft standing half in and half out, eh?" I unzipped the entrance just enough to see him. Rain dripping from his hair. Jacket dark with water. Eyes shining in the lantern light. Something about the sight made me forget how to breathe. "There's room," I said before thinking it through. "If you don't mind tight spaces." He hesitated only a moment, then nodded. "I've slept in worse." He crawled in, careful not to bump the walls, and sat opposite me, legs crossed. The tent felt suddenly smaller, the air warmer. Outside, rain drummed a steady rhythm. Soft, hypnotic, like the heartbeat of the land itself. For a while we just listened. He rubbed his hands together and said, "Smells of pine and wet wool in here." "That's me trying to smell like the forest instead of failure," I said with a small laugh. He looked at me properly then, brows knitting. "You came here running from something, didn't you?" "Someone," I admitted. "Or maybe several someones. Got tired of being the person people promise forever to and then forget?" He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected the answer. I know that ache. You?" He leaned back on one elbow, the lantern throwing soft gold over the lines of his face. "Was with someone years ago. Thought it would last. He said he liked the quiet out here, but turns out he only liked visiting it. Left one morning before the kettle boiled. I kept expecting him to ride back up the hill for weeks. He never did. The way he said it, calm, without bitterness, made my chest tighten. That must have been hard. Still is some days. But life doesn't stop for missing folk. The horse needs feeding. The fence still breaks." He said it like a man who'd learned resilience not from choice, but necessity. Another silence settled. Heavier but not uncomfortable. I stretched my legs, accidentally brushing his boot with mine. Neither of us moved away. "Cold, isn't it?" he murmured. "A bit." He reached behind him for a spare blanket. "Here." Before I could protest, he draped it across both our laps. The gesture was simple, almost thoughtless, but the warmth that followed wasn't just from the fabric. Minutes passed. The rain softened to a whisper. His shoulder was close enough that our sleeves touched. I could feel the heat of him through the thin layers of clothing, the slow steadiness of his breathing. He spoke first, voice barely above the hush of rain. It's been a long while since I shared a roof with anyone, even one made of canvas. Same, I said. Feels strange? In a good way. He turned his head slightly, eyes catching mine in the dim light. Can I ask something? Of course. Would it be all right if I put an arm round you? Just for warmth, nothing else. The gentleness in the question undid me. No assumption, no hunger, just quiet care. I nodded. Yeah, that'd be all right. He moved slowly, giving me every chance to change my mind, then slipped an arm around my shoulders. The weight of it was steady and sure. I leaned into him without meaning to, resting my temple against his chest. His heartbeat was there, strong and unhurried, echoing through layers of wool and skin. For a while we didn't speak. We just breathed. The world outside ceased to exist. No city, no past lovers, no ghosts. Only this, the rhythm of rain, the warmth between us, and the steady rise and fall of someone who felt safe. I must have closed my eyes, because the next thing I knew his fingers brushed mine beneath the blanket, a small accidental touch that lingered a fraction too long. I opened my eyes. He was watching me, not with intent but with quiet wonder, like he couldn't quite believe I was real. Evan, he said softly, testing my name as though it were fragile. Nothing, just nice to say out loud. I smiled before I could stop myself. When he leaned down and kissed me, it wasn't dramatic. It was soft, unsure, a meeting of two people who'd forgotten what gentleness felt like. The rain outside seemed to pause, holding its breath with us. His lips were warm, slightly rough, tasting faintly of coffee and smoke. I felt the familiar pull of wanting, but underneath it something steadier, trust. The kind that isn't built in a moment, but recognized in one. He drew back first, eyes searching mine. That all right? I nodded, throat too tight for words. We didn't rush. There were no frantic hands, no hunger to prove anything. Just the slow discovery of closeness, of belonging to the same silence. He rested his forehead against mine until both our breathing evened out again. Eventually we lay down, side by side, the blanket tucked around us. His arm found me again, protective but unpossessive. I felt his heartbeat under my ear and realized how long it had been since I'd slept, listening to something other than my own thoughts. As I drifted off, I thought of how strange life was, that you could come to the mountains to disappear and find, instead, someone who saw you clearer than anyone ever had. Outside, the storm faded into stillness. Inside, I slept against the chest of a man who smelled of earth and rain and quiet promises, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like home beginning. When I woke, it took me a moment to remember where I was. The tent glowed with faint morning light, pale gold seeping through the fabric. Outside, rain had given way to a clean stillness, the kind that follows a storm, where the air feels sharper, new again. Callum's arm rested loosely around my waist, his hand still against my side as though he'd fallen asleep mid-thought. I could hear his slow, steady breathing behind me, and the quiet warmth of it made something in my chest ache. I stayed still, for a while, eyes half open, listening to the world stir back to life. The distant drip of rain from branches, the creak of the horses' reins outside, a single bird calling through the mist. It was too peaceful to ruin with words. When he did stir, it was with that soft, graveled voice of his. Morning. Morning, I whispered back, my voice rough from sleep. He shifted away only enough to sit up, then reached for his pack. Made coffee, he said a few minutes later, handing me a tin mug. The smell alone nearly undid me. Earth, smoke, and something like kindness. We sat side by side outside the tent, legs stretched toward the cooling embers of last night's fire. The hills spread out before us in washed greens and grays, steam rising off the wet ground. The clouds were lifting slowly, revealing peaks still touched with white at the tips. Never gets old, that view, Callum said quietly. Feels like looking at another world, I murmured. One that never learnt to shout. He gave a faint smile. You get used to the quiet if you let it. We didn't say much after that. Words felt too clumsy for the moment. Instead, he stood, stretched, and began packing his things with that calm, measured rhythm he seemed to do everything with. When he saw me struggling with my tent poles, he stepped closer. Here, like this. He knelt beside me, large hands guiding the stubborn joint into place. His fingers brushed mine, rough, calloused, steady. A small touch, but it grounded me more than anything had in months. Once everything was packed, he nodded toward the horizon. My place isn't far. A couple of hours' walk, maybe less on the horse. There's a proper roof, a stove, and dry socks if you're lucky. You inviting me? I asked, trying to keep it light. He gave that small, lopsided grin. Just for a bit. No one should go a day after rain without a fire. I hesitated, though not because I didn't want to go. I just wasn't used to being wanted without expectation. All right, I said at last. Lead the way. He mounted first, then offered me his hand. When I took it, he pulled me up behind him with surprising ease. The saddle was wide enough for two, but I still had to hold on. Awkward at first, my hands hovering near his coat before settling around his middle. The horse moved forward, steady and sure-footed, her hooves sinking into the softened trail. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of heather and wet pine. Every now and then, Callum would murmur something low to the horse, his voice so gentle it barely stirred the air. I let my head rest lightly against his back. The rhythm of the horse's gait, the creak of leather, the slow rise and fall of his breath. It all felt impossibly safe. We followed the trail down into a valley where a small stream cut through mossy stones. Beyond it, tucked against a slope, stood a cottage. Stone walls weathered to silver gray, a roof patched in places, smoke curling lazily from a short chimney. The place looked as though it had grown out of the land itself. Modest but strong, built to last. This is it, Callum said, dismounting. He gave the horse a fond pat, then turned toward me, hand out again. I slid down carefully, landing too close, my boots nearly touching his. For a second, neither of us moved. It's beautiful, I said softly. He shrugged. Bit rough round the edges, like its owner. Inside, the air was warm and faintly scented with wood smoke. The main room was small but welcoming. A stone fireplace, a wooden table scarred by years of use, shelves lined with mismatched mugs and tins. A few old photographs sat on the mantel. Landscapes, a younger Callum with another man beside a horse. I looked but didn't ask. Make yourself at home, he said, hanging his coat by the door. I perched on a chair near the stove as he busied himself with the kettle. Watching him move, rolling his sleeves, stoking the fire, humming under his breath, I realized how long it had been since I'd been in a home that felt alive. Not polished or perfect, just lived in. When he set a bowl of soup in front of me, I smiled. You're full of surprises. Don't tell anyone, he said. They'll start expecting me to cook for them too. We ate quietly, spoons clinking softly against the bowls. The warmth spread slowly through me, easing something deeper than hunger. Afterwards, he showed me the rest of the place. A small bedroom with a handmade quilt, a loft where he stored tools, and a tiny bathroom with a basin that looked older than either of us. It's humble, he said, watching me take it in. It's home, I replied. He met my eyes then, something flickering behind his calm expression. It is. The rest of the day passed in a rhythm I didn't know I'd been craving. We fed the horse, stacked firewood, repaired a loose shutter. Every now and then, he'd glance my way, offering quiet guidance without ever taking over. It was easy, almost natural, the kind of ease you can't fake. As evening fell, the sky turned gold, bleeding into violet. We sat outside on a rough wooden bench, 2 mugs of tea between us. The hills stretched endlessly, painted in soft light. Do you ever get lonely out here? I asked. He thought for a long moment. Sometimes, but it's an honest kind of lonely, the kind that doesn't lie to you. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. I think I've had the dishonest kind for years. He looked at me then, not pitying, just seeing. You'll learn to tell the difference. We sat there until the first stars appeared, neither of us speaking. The silence between us had changed again. It wasn't the brittle quiet of strangers anymore. It was something shared, gentle, real. When the chill crept in, he stood and offered his hand. Come on. Fire's still going. Inside, the cottage glowed with warmth. As I stepped over the threshold, a strange thought crossed my mind. That maybe this wasn't a pause in my life after all. Maybe it was the start of something I hadn't dared to imagine. Callum shut the door behind us. The wind rattled against the window once, then softened. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't want to leave anywhere else. By the time 10 days had passed at Callum's cottage, the rhythm of life there had wrapped itself around me like an old jumper that fit too well to take off. Every morning he'd be up before sunrise, stoking the fire, boiling water in that dented old kettle. I'd wake to the smell of smoke and coffee and the soft scrape of his boots on the stone floor. We rarely spoke much at first. Our conversations began after the second cup, when the sky turned pale and the frost started to loosen its grip on the fields. Days blurred together in a quiet sort of beauty. We mended a section of fence that had given up to the wind, planted early spring bulbs beside the porch, brushed down the horse until her coat shone like chestnut glass. Sometimes we worked in silence, other times we hummed old tunes he said his gran used to sing. Evenings were the best, simple dinners, the soft hiss of logs in the stove, and that unspoken closeness that comes when two people stop pretending they're not falling into something gentle. I should have known it couldn't last untouched. Peace never stays quiet forever. It started with the sound I'd forgotten. A shrill, artificial tone that didn't belong to this place. My phone. It had been buried at the bottom of my rucksack, switched off since the day I left London. I'd almost managed to forget it existed. But that morning, while Callum was outside mending a broken gate, something made me dig it out. Curiosity, maybe, or guilt. I plugged it into the wall socket and watched the screen come alive again. 42 messages, 15 missed calls, 9 emails. Most of it was noise. Friends wondering if I was alive, colleagues asking when I'd be back, adverts pretending to care. But one email stopped me cold. It was from my old editor, the one I'd interviewed with before I vanished. The job I'd thought was long gone. We'd like to offer you the position full-time starting next week. Competitive salary. Exciting projects. Let us know by Friday. 2 days. I stared at the words until they blurred. This was the kind of opportunity I'd spent years chasing. Everything I thought I'd wanted, security, recognition, the proof that all those long nights in the city meant something. But reading it, all I could think about was the sound of Callum's laughter when the horse tried to steal his sandwich, or how the world seemed to hold its breath whenever he looked at me for a heartbeat too long. I set the phone down, suddenly feeling sick. The house felt smaller, the silence heavier. When Callum came back in, cheeks red from the cold, I tried to smile. "You fixed it?" "Aye," he said, dusting his hands on his jeans. "Gate'll last another season at least." He noticed the phone on the table almost immediately. "Didn't think you brought that thing to the hills?" "Neither did I said quietly. Something in my voice must have given me away because his eyes softened. "Bad news?" I hesitated. "I got a job offer." He nodded slowly. "That's good, isn't it?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It's everything I used to want. Big role, good pay, all of it. But it's in London, full-time." He didn't say anything for a long while. Just stood there, the firelight flickering across his face. "And you're thinking about taking it?" I let out a breath that sounded more like a confession. "I don't know what I'm thinking. I came here to clear my head, not lose it." He gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You wouldn't be the first to get lost in these hills." That night, we didn't talk much. We sat by the fire as always, but the air between us felt different, thicker, weighted. He was staring into the flames, and I could see the reflection of them in his eyes, gold and sad. Finally, he said, very quietly, "If you go, I won't stop you." My throat tightened. "You wouldn't try to." He shook his head. "Never believed in holding people where they don't choose to stay. But I'll miss you, Evan, more than I should, maybe." I looked down at my hands, the firelight trembling across them. "Callum," he smiled faintly, "I'll wait for a while, just in case you remember what peace feels like." I didn't sleep much after that. The wind howled against the window, and the sound of it tore straight through me. I kept thinking of London, the endless noise, the screens, the faces that never looked up. And then I'd think of this place, the smell of rain on soil, Callum's quiet voice in the mornings, the way the stars looked close enough to touch. By dawn, I'd made up my mind, or thought I had. I packed my bag, folded my clothes, tried to tell myself it was just for a while. That leaving didn't have to mean losing. When Callum came downstairs, I was standing by the door, rucksack over my shoulder. He froze for a heartbeat, then nodded once. "You off then?" "I just need to think," I said. "Aye." His voice was soft. "You'll find your answer one way or another." The way he said it hurt worse than if he'd shouted. The walk to the gate felt longer than it had any right to. Each step away from the cottage pulled at me like a thread unraveling. I could still hear the faint clatter of tools from behind the barn, the horse's distant whinny, the echo of his last words. When I reached the gate, I stopped. The view stretched wide and endless. The same hills that had felt like freedom when I first arrived now looked like a question I couldn't answer. I thought about the people I'd loved before, the ones who said they'd stay and didn't, the ones who promised warmth and handed me cold instead. None of them had ever offered stillness. None of them had made me feel like I could stop running. But Callum had, without trying, without asking for anything in return. I closed my eyes and let the wind hit my face. It smelt of peat and pine and rain, and him. I turned around. The walk back was quicker, lighter. My heart beat hard, not from climbing but from certainty. I found him behind the barn, pitchfork in hand, scattering hay into the trough. He didn't hear me at first. His back was tense, shoulders too straight. He must have known. "Callum," I said quietly. He turned slowly. When he saw me standing there, his eyes flickered with something that looked like disbelief. "I'm not going anywhere," I said before he could speak. He frowned slightly. "You sure? I've spent years chasing the kind of life everyone said I should want," I said. "But none of it ever made me feel like this place does. Like you do." I took a step closer. "I don't know what's ahead, and I'm scared out of my mind. But if peace has a face, it's yours." For a moment he didn't move. Then he dropped the pitchfork into the hay and crossed the space between us in 3 strides. His hand came up, cupping the side of my face, his thumb brushing my cheek. "You're sure about this?" he whispered. I nodded. "I'm done running." He didn't kiss me straight away. He just pulled me into him, arms firm and steady, his breath warm against my ear. The smell of hay and earth and smoke filled my lungs, grounding me completely. "I was half hoping you'd say that," he murmured. I laughed shakily against his shoulder. "You and your quiet patience," he smiled into my hair. "Good things don't need chasing, Evan. They just need choosing." I held on to him like the world might shift if I let go. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The city would always exist. The emails, the noise, the endless pretending to be fine. But I didn't belong there anymore. I belonged here, in this wild, quiet corner of the world, with the man who taught me that peace isn't found by running away. It's found when you finally stop. It's strange how quickly time changes its shape when you stop counting it. Days used to drag in the city, each one loud and heavy, filled with clocks and notifications. Here they slipped past softly, like mist moving through the hills. It's been months since that morning by the barn, when I chose to stay. The world didn't end when I didn't go back. No one from work came storming up the valley demanding my return. The emails stopped eventually, the silence stayed, and so did I. I learned how to live in it. Not as an escape anymore, but as a rhythm. Callum taught me how to mend a fence without cursing, how to tell when rain's coming by the smell of the air, how to trust a horse to read your nerves better than any person ever could. In return, I taught him how to make sourdough that didn't break teeth, and convinced him to finally let me repaint the cottage windows. We argued over colors for 3 days and ended up with the same white they'd been before. Still, he said it looked fresh, and that was good enough. Our life wasn't dramatic. No grand gestures, no sweeping declarations. Just small, ordinary kindnesses. A hand brushing mine while passing a mug. A glance that lingered too long across the kitchen table. Laughter when the wind blew the washing line into the mud again. It was enough. More than enough. One crisp morning in late autumn, I woke to find him gone. Not gone, just not inside. I checked the yard, then the field, and finally spotted him up near the workshop behind the barn. He was sanding something, his shirt rolled to his elbows, hair tousled, sawdust clinging to his forearms. "Busy?" I called. He turned, caught, that faint grin playing at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe. Don't look yet." "That's not suspicious at all," I said, laughing. He spent the rest of the morning there, refusing to tell me what he was doing. Every now and then I'd hear the rhythmic thud of a hammer, or the scrape of a plane smoothing wood. The air smelled of cedar and effort. By the time he called me over, the sun was already dipping behind the ridge. He stood beside the pickup truck, wiping his hands on a rag, and behind him, resting in the bed of the truck, was a wooden bench. It was beautiful. Simple and solid, curved to fit the body, the wood polished to a soft honey glow. And right in the center, carved by hand, were 2 small letters joined by a plus sign. E+C. "You made this?" I breathed. He shrugged, looking suddenly shy. "Thought that old stump by the ridge deserved retirement. Figured this might do better." I walked closer, running my fingers along the carving. The surface was smooth but warm beneath my touch. "Callum, this is—" My throat closed. "It's perfect." He ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise. Didn't want to make a fuss. Just thought we should have somewhere proper to sit when the sun goes down. We loaded it into the truck together, the wood heavier than it looked. He drove us up the narrow track that wound to the ridge, the same one where I'd first camped alone months before. The same place I'd heard his horse in the dark. The world looked different now, softer somehow. The two pines still stood like sentinels. Between them, the view opened wide to the valley, the loch glinting below, the hills fading into gold and blue. We placed the bench beneath those trees, facing west. Not bad, eh? He said, wiping his hands. Not bad at all. We sat. The wood creaked slightly beneath our weight. The air was cool, the kind of evening that smelt faintly of peat and wood smoke from far-off cottages. The sky was beginning its slow transformation, amber bleeding into rose, then violet. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We didn't need to. Our shoulders brushed, our hands found each other naturally, resting on the carved letters between us. I thought about everything that had led me here. The heartbreaks, the noise, the endless trying to prove I was worth staying for. And then I thought about this man beside me, who never once asked me to be anything other than still. You know, I said quietly. I used to think love was meant to be loud, dramatic, full of fireworks and promises shouted across crowds. And now? He asked. Now I think it sounds like this. I squeezed his hand. Wind in the grass, horses in the field. You asking me if I've eaten yet? He smiled, that small, crooked smile that always reached his eyes. That's love enough for me. We watched the sun drop behind the distant hills, the light spilling across the land in ribbons of gold. The bench creaked again as he leaned closer, pressing a soft kiss to my temple. Peace looks good on you, he murmured. I turned my head slightly, our foreheads touching. You gave it to me, he shook his head. You found it yourself. I just kept the kettle warm. We stayed until the last of the light faded, the stars waking one by one. When the air grew colder, we didn't move. My fingers traced the carved initials again. Small proof that something lasting could exist quietly, without needing to be announced. Eventually I whispered, Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't lost your way that night? He chuckled softly. I'd probably still be mending that fence in the dark. And I'd still be convincing myself solitude was healing. He turned to look at me, eyes warm. Seems we were both overdue a bit of luck, I smiled. Maybe luck's just another word for timing. Below us, the valley had fallen into shadow, but the ridge still held the faint afterglow of sunset. I rested my head on his shoulder and let the world breathe around us. No grand ending, no fireworks. Just two men on a hill, the quiet hum of belonging between them. Sometimes I think about that first night. The fire, the mist, the echo of hooves. I'd gone into the highlands to disappear, convinced I had nothing left to offer. Instead, I found someone who saw the quiet parts of me as worth staying for. The bench stands there still, weathered now, its wood silvering with time. When we sit there, sometimes in silence, sometimes with our mugs of tea, I think of how simple it all turned out to be. Love didn't rescue me. It just met me where I was, patient as the hills. And when I look at those carved letters, E+C, I remember that not all stories need to end with fireworks. Some end with peace. Some end with someone's hand in yours, watching the sun fade and realizing you've finally stopped running. The highlands don't keep everyone, but they kept me because he was there.